Instant kill! Ah, shit!
Incoming frag! Incoming smoke!
Tired of that. It's called experience.
Let me go where that came from.
I'm back here. this man's head.
Here we go! Sucks to be you!
I will not be.
Target my mark! Enemy mark! Ooh, look at that sucker go!
That's my line of fire. Why the hell?
Oh no. Oh hell no.
ammo now! Throwing smoke!
Cámara, perros. Ya dos. Birro.
Thank you so much. For coming. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here. I know I've seen some of you all before, but then again, you all look vaguely familiar, but it's a lot of fun and also just nice to be back in Seattle. And this is a particularly lovely venue that I've never seen before, and it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing with my colleagues and that appears in the book that we've written, and the work that I do is heavily influenced by the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. But let me back up a little bit and just start by pointing out that ever since antiquity, a lot of people, philosophers, theologians, more recently scientists, have spent a lot of time just thinking about the essence of our humanity. What is it that really captures what it means to be a human being? And I know many of you are familiar with the notion of humans as Homo sapiens. Who's heard that term before? And forgetting for a moment about whether or not we're worthy of that designation these days, I think everybody knows that that refers to human beings as uniquely and quintessentially rational and wise creatures. But that's not the only proverbial homo that has been advanced as just an effort to characterize what it is that makes us uniquely human. There was another one at the beginning of the 20th century, Homo ludens, the argument being that we're uniquely playful creatures. And then there was another one after that, Hannah Arendt. The idea was Homo faber, that we're tool-making creatures. And then we've got from Seattle, Ellen Dissanayake talks about Homo aestheticus, the idea that we're fundamentally aesthetic creatures. And my view is that all of those designations are useful for heuristic purposes. They give us, or they draw our attention rather, to particular aspects of the human experience that I think are worthy of our collective cogitation and deliberation. But I want to add another homo to the table. In our book, we call it Homo mortalis. And I started thinking about this many years ago, actually, before I ran into Ernest Becker, or his work, rather. The Scottish essayist, a guy named Alexander Smith, in the 1850s, in a little essay, he said, "It is the knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." And then William James, a couple of decades after that, in the 1890s, he said that death is the worm at the core of the human experience, this being a not so subtle reference to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Eve partaking of the apple from the tree of knowledge, and that rendering us aware of the fact that we will someday die. And then, as you've already heard, and many of you already know, Ernest Becker took that idea and in 1974 was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the book The Denial of Death, for elaborating that notion through an evolutionary and existential psychodynamic perspective in the service of trying to generate a comprehensive delineation of the psychological underpinnings of what motivates human beings to do the things that they do, for better and worse. And so what Becker asks us to do, excuse me for 1 second. Hot under the French fry lights. Anyway, what Becker says is that He proposes that what we do is to just start with the relatively Darwinian assumption that people share with all other forms of life a basic biological predisposition towards self-preservation in the service of survival and reproduction. And I think that's relatively straightforward. Equally straightforward is when he says, yes, we have that basic drive to stay alive with all other forms of life. On the other hand, we are arguably unique by virtue of our enlarged forebrain, and we have the cognitive capacities to think in abstract and symbolic ways, culminating in the unique ability to imagine things that do not yet exist, and then to have the audacity to transform our dreams into imagination. And I know I've been using the same example for a long time, but it's a good one. Historically, when Michelangelo was drawing pictures of helicopters in his notebooks in the 1500s, people said, wow, that's crazy. And yet today, here we are, routinely transported by what was originally denounced as the doodling of a madman. And I like how Otto Rank, one of Freud's disciples, put it when he said that only human beings make the unreal real. And I think it's pretty obvious that that's very handy in terms of helping us to stay alive. All right, let's hold that thought and move back in time. Darwin is the 1860s or so. And let's go back to Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existential philosopher in the 1840s. Kierkegaard was just back in the day, we didn't even have psychology in those days. And he said, you know what? People are so smart that we actually become aware of the fact that we exist. Not a trick question, even for the Skidmore students. Who's aware of the fact that you sit here now listening to me or pretending to do so? All right, I'm going to take that as a unanimous affirmation. And the point that Kierkegaard makes is that we are constantly aware of the fact that we exist. Today in psychology, we call that self-awareness or self-consciousness. And Kierkegaard's point is that we take it for granted that we're self-conscious because, after all, most of us spend a lot of our days just kind of walking down the street saying, here I am, walking down the street. But the point that Kierkegaard makes is that only human beings are totally self-aware. And the point that he makes is that it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to, in his language, render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. All right, well, so what? In a little book called Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard went on to say, well, if you are aware of the fact that you exist, which he insists is the unique purview of the human animal, then you will necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that Kierkegaard described as awe and dread, respectively. And I like those words because most of us are familiar with them. Right, so let's have like 90 seconds of awesomeness before things take a sinister turn. And note that there's something awesome and really profoundly uplifting about being alive and knowing it. A rhetorical question: who would prefer to be a person rather than a porcupine or a potted plant? Up to you to decide. But Kierkegaard's point is that some of our finest moments are not the result of anything great. It's not the days that we wake up and we've done anything in particular, but some days you just wake up happy to be alive. Who's ever had one of those days? I grew up in New Jersey, so they're few and far between. Anyway, the point, and it's an important and profound one, and let's not forget it, is that it is indeed great to be alive. And the fact that we're not only alive, but we know that we're alive, it is really tremendously awesome and uplifting. Right, on the other hand, Kierkegaard turns right around and he says, okay, but if you're smart enough to be aware that you exist, you should also be smart enough to recognize that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration. You know, it's a great night, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but this means you as well as me. And what Kierkegaard pointed out is that this is a most unwelcome realization the discomfort of which is magnified by the concurrent recognition that not only will you die someday, but you can die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control. And then Becker, borrowing some ideas from Freud just to knee us in the psychological groin, he adds to that, yeah, we don't like that we have to die. We don't like that we could die at any time for reasons that we can't anticipate or control. We don't like the fact that we're animals, that like it or not, we're ensconced in a physical carcass, and that from a purely biological point of view, we're literally breathing pieces of defecating meat that are no more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And the point that Becker asks us to entertain is that if that's all that we went around thinking about, I'm gonna die, I could walk out today and get run over by a car or smote by a comet. I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat. I'm spam with a plan, but I've got no can. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I got a lot of these. I'm a pate with panache. I'm a cerebral head cheese. I'm meat with a beat. Stop me, somebody. All right, but anyway, you get the point, I hope. And what Becker argues is that those realizations, I will die, I could die at any time. I'm just a twitching throb of biological protoplasm. If that's all we thought about, we wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We would literally be potentially debilitated by overwhelming existential terror. And what Becker hypothesizes is that our ancestors rather ingeniously solved the existential dilemma that was engendered by the awareness of death, which is in turn an unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence through the creation and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture, humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with fellow humans in the service of reducing death anxiety by giving us each a sense that we are valuable people in a meaningful universe. And so Deborah mentioned earlier one of Ernest Becker's early books called The Birth and Death of Meaning. And in that book, Becker talks about the human need to perceive that life has meaning and that each of us has value. And he points out that what culture does is to give us a sense that life has meaning in a variety of ways, including the fact that almost every culture in the history of Earth has an account of the origin of the universe. Almost every culture, in fact, all of them, have prescriptions for appropriate conduct that give us a blueprint of effective or acceptable action. And all of this is in the service of giving us a sense that we are potentially eligible for immortality, either literally in the form of the heavens, the afterlives, the souls, the reincarnations of the world's great religions, or symbolically, as the ancient Greeks pointed out. We may know that we are not going to be here forever, but we're comforted nevertheless by the realization that some vestige of ourselves will persist over time. Perhaps in the form of having children, perhaps in the form of amassing great fortunes, perhaps in the form of writing a great symphony or book or producing a great work of art. Like, so on the one hand, in order to stand up in the morning, we have to think that life has meaning, that is necessary but not sufficient. We also need to believe that each of us as individuals has value. Again, rhetorical question, who remembers being a kid? I know that most of you do. And did anybody when you were a kid dream of doing something great? Anybody ever do that? I'm gonna cure cancer, I'm gonna be a great athlete, I'm gonna make a lot of money and maybe do something good for the human race. And the point that Becker makes is that that's not pathological narcissism in and of itself. That's the normal yearning of the human animal to want to believe that each of us has some unique purpose in life. And the way that culture provides opportunities for us to feel valuable is through the social roles that we inhabit in the context of our culture, because every social role comes with it standards of what is considered admirable, and if you meet or exceed those standards, you can perceive yourself as a significant individual in a meaningful universe. So if you're a football player, your job is to play football and do it well. If you're a nurse, your job is to keep people alive. If you're a stockbroker, your job is to increase somebody's material well-being, and so on and so forth. Well, that's pretty much what Ernest Becker says. Human beings are unique by virtue of our vast intelligence. That in turn makes us aware of the fact that we will someday die. That unsettling realization gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror that's mitigated by embracing culturally constructed worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and we have value. All right, two questions. One question is, so what? And the other question is, well, how do we know if any of this is true? And the so what question in my world as an experimental psychologist, and what a lot of scientists would say is, well, okay, here's some ideas, they may be interesting, but from a scientific point of view, the question is, well, okay, well, so what? What's the explanatory power? If we accept that what Becker is arguing has merit, then what does this help us understand that would be difficult or impossible to fathom otherwise? And then the other question is, I got to get a watch someday. Checking my stocks. Where's Sophie? I just saw your text. Where are you? Oh, thanks, Sophie. All right. Anyway, so question number one is, so what? You know, what do these ideas buy us in terms of helping us understand the vagaries of human affairs? And then the second question is, yeah, how do we know if this is true? Although Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death, he was roundly denounced by a lot of academics at the time as being too philosophical and therefore highly speculative and therefore unscientific. All right, so what I'd like to do in the rest of the time that we have together this evening is to just kind of tackle those two questions at the same time by bouncing through a couple of the areas of inquiry that Deborah already mentioned, and to talk about how Becker's ideas can help us understand a host of superficially disparate phenomena with regard to human behavior. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the experiments that I've done with my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Kaczynski. We started out in the 1970s, and we're still doing this work, and so are a lot of our students, and now a lot of folks around the world that we've never met before. All right, let's start with one of Ernest Becker's primary interests, articulated throughout his work, but really the central focus of his last book called Escape from Evil. And the question here is, why is it that people have such a painfully difficult time getting along with other people who don't share their beliefs about the nature of reality? And in fact, if you go back and look at human history, it's really not a pretty picture. I think a case could be made that it's been one long sequence of genocidal atrocities juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors. And there's no evidence that that has changed recently. And so the question is, why? Why can't we get along with people who don't salute the same flag, don't worship the same God, don't sing the same songs, or wear the same clothes? And Becker's response, and actually it's more complex than I'll have time to present this evening, but in short, what he asks us to consider momentarily is, let's assume he says that his argument is correct, that our beliefs about reality serve to reduce death anxiety. Well, the point that he makes then is, to the extent that that's true, then the mere existence of other human beings who do not share those beliefs is fundamentally threatening. Because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you do so necessarily by undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own views. And when you do that, you literally eradicate the anxiety buffering properties of those particular beliefs. And so the point that he tries to get us to think about is that the mere existence of people who are different really threatens us, because it presents the possibility that our beliefs might be wrong. So if I believe that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break, then I run into the people of the Borneo in the South Pacific, and they believe that the earth was gestated out of a giant coconut. Well, if they're right, then I've got to be wrong. And so, well, what do we do when we run into people who are different? Well, the first thing that we generally do is to denounce or denigrate them. Well, okay, I believe God created the earth in 6 days. The Borneo think otherwise, but they're ignorant savages that are wearing grass skirts, living in tents, worshiping piles of sticks and mud. And of course, therefore, I'm being silly, by the way, they're not privy to our beliefs. I'm being silly, but there's an important point here, and that is when you diminish the humanity of someone who adheres to different beliefs, it makes it much easier to retain confidence in your own. And while you're doing that, we generally try to get other people to change their beliefs and adopt ours instead. And if that doesn't work, just kill those poor bastards, thus proving that your beliefs are more potent after all. My God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. And the point that Ernest Becker makes in Escape from Evil is that this may be one of the, certainly not the only, but one of the main reasons why we can't get along with people who are different, because it is very difficult to abandon our allegiance to our own death-denying beliefs. All right, so how do we know that this is true? This is where Tom and Jeff and I come in the early 1980s. We developed a very simple paradigm that I'm going to tell you a bit about, and this is going to help us out for the rest of our time this evening, and it's called the mortality salience paradigm. And what we did was to, we thought to ourselves, well, okay, if Ernest Becker is right, then what would happen if in a laboratory situation we brought people into the lab and we reminded some people of their own mortality? And then in control groups, we remind people of something unpleasant but not fatal. So we're going to bring people into the lab. We're going to remind some people that they're going to die someday. Sometimes we just ask them to write down some of their thoughts and feelings associated with their own death. Sometimes we have them fill out a death anxiety questionnaire. Sometimes we have them watch gory films of like car accidents. Sometimes we don't do work in the lab. We bring people outdoors and we stop folks either in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. Sometimes we do something even more subtle. We bring people back into the lab and we flash the word death on a computer screen for 28 milliseconds, so fast that you don't even know that you've been flashed. And all of the things that I'm about to talk about, doesn't matter how we remind people that they're going to die, it all produces the same effects. And so, for example, in one of our first studies, we asked Christian participants to either think about death as something unpleasant, and then we had them rate fellow students who either said they came from Christian families or from Jewish households. And what we found is that while our Christian participants did not discriminate one way or the other in the control condition, when they were reminded of their mortality, they liked fellow Christians a lot more, and they dislike Jewish people quite a bit. And some of you have heard me say this before. We did this study at the University of Arizona, and this is not about Christianity per se. The 5 Jewish people in Arizona were busy that day, so we had Christian participants in that particular study. If you go to Israel and you ask Jewish people to think about dying, they love Jewish people and they hate Christians. If you go to India and ask people to think about their own death, they love Indians, they hate Pakistanis, etc., etc. And this effect does not just obtain in attitudinal measures. In Germany, when Germans are reminded of their mortality, they sit closer to people who look German. and they sit further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. In Iran, we worked with a fellow psychologist, and we reminded Iranians of their mortality, and then we asked them how much they supported suicide bombing and how much they would like to become a suicide bomber. And what we found was quite striking. In control conditions, Iranians were not all that enthused about suicide bombing, and they certainly didn't want to become one. But after they were reminded of their mortality, they were much more supportive of martyrdom activities and more willing to become a martyr themselves. I don't know about you, but I find that disconcerting. Right, in America, we are far too pragmatic to blow ourselves up, but we're happy to blow up other people. And so when Americans are reminded of their mortality, they become more supportive of the use of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons against countries who pose no direct threat to us. And this is particularly true of people who identify as politically conservative. I could tell you, if we had more time, hundreds of these studies, but I think the point that I would like to make is that there's a whole lot of evidence suggesting, and I like how George Bernard Shaw put this in a play called Heartbreak House, where he says, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. Right, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about something that was very important to Ernest Becker, and that is, why is it that sometimes we become attracted to certain kinds of political leaders that we might not be overly enthusiastic about at other historical moments? Who's ever heard of the dead German sociologist Max Weber? Has anybody ever heard of Weber? My Weber joke is that if you need a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia, a paragraph or two of Weber will do the trick. But I don't think that in any way undermines the importance of his ideas. And one of the things that Weber wrote about in the early part of the 20th century is the idea that in times of historical upheaval, people become particularly attracted to what he called a charismatic leader. Who's heard the term charismatic leader? Well, that comes from Max Weber, and he defined the charismatic leader as someone who is perceived by his or her followers as kind of a magical, larger-than-life figure who often proclaims, or whose supporters proclaim, that he or she has been chosen by God to rid the world of evil. This is often advanced as an explanation for how Hitler got in power in Germany. Who's familiar with that idea? That Hitler may not have gotten all that many votes if things were going well in Germany. I would submit he probably would not. Well, I wasn't around in those days, but I was around in the aftermath of the terrible events of September 11th, 2001. Who remembers that? I know a lot of you do, those of us that are old enough to remember. And who remembers President George W. Bush, who before September 11th, 2001, had one of the lowest approval ratings of every president in the history of Earth, who also remembers, though, that 3 weeks after the events of September 11th, President Bush had one of the highest approval ratings. Head shakes if you remember this, because this was amongst Democrats as well as Republicans. And Tom and Jeff and I, we got interested in this, and we're like, wow, how could this happen? Maybe the president metamorphosized from a functionally illiterate oil industry neocon meat puppet into an effective civil servant. Maybe. Maybe, on the other hand, the events of September 11th constituted kind of a natural reminder of death. And maybe Americans embraced the president because, just like Weber said, when the psychological hits the fan, it makes us grope for someone who says, I will rid the world of evil. And indeed, that's what President Bush did say right after September 11th. He said, we will get the evildoers. And in October of 2001, he said, I believe that God has chosen me to lead the country at this difficult time. All right, well, we did a bunch of experiments in 2003 and 2004, and what we did was very simple. We just had some people think about dying and other people not, and then we said, well, what do you think about President Bush and his policies in Iraq? And what we found was really quite, I think, staggering, because in about a dozen experiments, we found that Americans across the country did not have particularly high impressions of President Bush or his policies in Iraq under psychologically benign conditions. But when they were reminded of their mortality first, their approval of the president skyrocketed along with their support for his policies in Iraq. In fact, in one study conducted 5 weeks before the 2004 election, we found that Americans in a control condition said they would be voting for Senator Kerry by a 4-to-1 margin, but those who were randomly assigned to think about dying said they would be voting for President Bush by about a 3-to-1 margin. I would ask you to just think about the ominous implications of that finding for democracy. And just for those of you that are willing to recoil in horror along with me, we just finished our first study demonstrating that when Americans are reminded of their death a month ago, it increased in a pronounced fashion their support for Donald Trump's candidacy for president and their willingness to vote for him. And I'm not trying to tell you who to vote for. I don't think this is a politically partisan claim. I think anyone who's a fan of democracy should be very concerned by the fact that a relatively subtle alteration in psychological conditions can have such profound effects on political preferences. Right, let's keep going a little bit. Let's talk about how existential concerns foster an alienation from nature and a contempt for the environment. In 1690, John Locke, second treatise on government, in a very lovely paragraph, he says, well, you know what? Anything in nature is like all things. It's ephemeral. Everything in nature is of finite duration. And indeed, some argue that's the psychological impetus for the construction of supernature. If we were happy with the natural state of affairs, there would be no need to conjure up an additional supernatural dimension. And in fact, what we find in our studies is that when people are reminded of their mortality, it makes us very uncomfortable, admitting that we're animals. In fact, we deny vigorously after we're reminded of death that we're animals. And after we're reminded of death, we have negative attitudes towards animals, and we're more willing to support killing them for reasons other than eating or medical research. When people are reminded of death, they become more uncomfortable with their own bodies, including basic biological functions. Even sex becomes more aversive after one is reminded of death. When people are reminded of their mortality, they're very uncomfortable in nature. There's some Dutch psychologists that I like a lot, and they showed Dutch people pictures of forests and pictures of suburban neighborhoods with lawns and stuff. And what they found is that in controlled conditions, the Dutch participants liked the forests more than the suburban neighborhoods, but when they were reminded of their mortality, they liked the neighborhoods better than the forest. And finally, when people are reminded of their mortality, they become more willing to exploit non-renewable natural resources. And so in simulated forest games, when people are told, oh, if you harvest too many trees, you're going to destroy the whole forest. Well, under control conditions, people say, well, okay, I'm going to harvest fewer trees, but not when they're reminded of their mortality. They will exploit natural resources to the point where they're no longer able to be renewed. And of course, that runs the risk of rendering the planet that we now reside on unfit for human habitation. Of course, the jellyfish and the cockroach will be fine, but our descendants might have a tougher time. Right, so if we're going to talk about the degradation of the natural environment, I don't think we can do that without also pointing out that in the West at least, in fact, increasingly in every industrial society that tries to emulate our way of life, people have an almost insatiable desire for money and stuff. I'm from New York. Do they have places to shop out here? I think they do. But anyway, and so why is it? If we had more time, I would talk a lot about the danger of insatiable desires, because any desire that is insatiable is ultimately unstable and unsustainable. Who's familiar with Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof? Old timers? I love that play. Remember Big Daddy who says the human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason he buys everything that he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he's got the crazy idea that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And Ernest Becker writes very eloquently about the possibility that our insatiable desire for money and stuff is in part a result of existential anxieties. All right, well, sure enough, when we remind people of death and ask them, well, how much money do you want to have? They say they want to have more money. Way more than they need, by the way. And when we remind people of death and we ask them, okay, what kinds of things do you want? They want a lot more things. Not like a toaster or a pencil sharpener. They want like a Lexus and a Rolex, high status luxury items. When we remind people of death, this study was done by some Polish psychologists, and we asked them to draw pictures of coins and paper money. What we find is that after a death reminder, people draw the coins larger. We don't ask them to do that. We just say, hey, draw a quarter, draw a dollar bill. And I
Oh,
For allowing me to invade your academic environment. For a while, I got a little glimpse at the course that you're involved in when Neil gave me a copy of the syllabus, and it really does seem like an excellent experience. Have you been enjoying it? It's a rhetorical question, but of course when your professor's here, you don't have much in the way of alternatives. I'd argue, though, that the topic of death in the context of a traditional academic curriculum has been much neglected, and that I don't think you can consider yourself a properly educated individual without coming to terms with, both intellectually and emotionally, with the notion of the inevitability of your own demise. And this was an issue that was of central concern, as Jim and Neil have pointed out, of the late cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker in a variety of books, starting with one called The Birth and Death of Meaning, written in 1962, and ending with Becker's untimely demise in 1975, with a book called Escape from Evil. Becker was relentlessly preoccupied with trying to get us as individuals to understand the pervasive role of the uniquely human awareness of death in all aspects of life. And so Becker was interested in death as something that's interesting and important for us as human beings to wonder about in its own right. But he had a broader interest, and in his language, he called it the general science of man. He wrote in very gender-biased terms. These days, we'd call it humans to acknowledge the other half of the human species. But what Becker said is, hey, it is the responsibility of social scientists from all of the disciplines, sociology, philosophy, history, psychology, probably left a few out, but all of the sciences, he claimed, are responsible for teaming up to provide us with a comprehensive account of all aspects of human behavior. And for Becker, this was both an intellectual challenge as well as a personal one. Intellectually, he said, hey, just as we have a theory of evolution that helps us understand all of biology, and just as we have Einstein's relativity theory and now quantum mechanics from the physicists to help us understand all of the physical universe, that the social scientists should step up to the plate and provide us with a broad paradigm that helps us understand the basic nature of humankind. And that's exactly what Becker proceeded to do, and that's what I'd like to do today, is to tell you a little bit about his ideas. I had a handout floating around. Has everybody got a white piece of paper? Anybody not? Not? Are there any extras floating about? If there are, let's see if we can get them to migrate over. Any extras of these? I kind of need this one. My talk's on the back of it. I don't like to stray too far from my promptings. Are there any of those? We can just float these around. No, that's not what I was looking for. All right, here we go. Yeah, if we got another, let's float some of these things around. I'm going to refer to some of these things later. I don't want you to leave empty-handed. You can train your puppy. You can put one of these on the bottom of your bird cage. These things. Okay, I'll let you guys work that out, but I will need you to refer to this white piece of paper at some point. Anyway, what Becker said is, look, let's step back a little bit and try and think about what it is that renders human beings distinctly and uniquely different from all other forms of life. And so let me let you guys get into the action. If you had to think of a single attribute that differentiates us from lizards and potatoes, what would it be for you? Anybody? Ooh, speech is good, and in order to talk, what do you need? Pardon me? Yeah, you need a vocabulary. In order to have that, what do you need? Intelligence, good. How about the big brain, right? The fly's got a brain, but you can balance about 50,000 of them on the top of a pin. You have an enormous brain, not only in terms of volume, but I'm sure they study the convolutions of the brain, allowing us to stuff a lot into a small bowling ball-sized head, right? You know, yes? Yeah, no? All right, you know this, but your brain, or you should know this, is relatively large compared to other living creatures. And I hope I'm not being too homocentric when I suggest to you that human beings are imbued with a vast intelligence that renders us fundamentally different than all other living creatures, and that enables us to do things without which we would not be here today. I would submit to you, first of all, that as a physical specimen, each of you are pathetic and unable to function in any autonomous sense on the virtue of your physical attributes, right? People are not large, we're not fast, our senses are terrible, you can't see shit, you can't smell, your teeth aren't sharp. If we dropped you in the middle of the Himalayas by yourself and told you to have a nice life, it would be a rather short one indeed, because none of us, a squirrel or a cockroach, would be fine. You would not be fine. And the reason is because biologically speaking, from an evolutionary perspective, we are not well adapted physically in order to stay alive. But rather what we do have going for us, as Darwin pointed out over a century ago, is our sublime ability to engage in sophisticated cognitive activities in the service of cooperating with each other in the development of an elaborate set of social institutions that allows us to collectively continue to exist. Right? In very simple terms, we're smart, and that's why we're here. And there's two things that I'll mention about being smart that are real important with regard to why it's adapted from an evolutionary perspective. Thing number one is being smart, interestingly enough, allows you in many situations to not behave, to stand back and say, whoa, wait a minute, this is an interesting situation. I've got to ponder what my options are here. So one of the things that Becker pointed out is that intelligence is not always directed at getting one to behave, but rather getting one to delay behavior long enough to ponder what the alternatives are. When a fly or an insect sees a light bulb, what does it do? Flies right towards it. Doesn't have any choice. The behavior is instinctively determined. When you're stepping over a 2-inch crack in a sidewalk, you have a problem with that for the most part if you're not physically disabled. Right? You don't have any problem. You step over. You come to the next crack. You do that thing, step on the crack and break your mother's back. Right? So you step over, next crack. Right? Then you come to a point where you have a 100-yard wide pit of flaming oil. What do you do to that? You step over that? Maybe, but then that wouldn't work out too well. So you can say, whoa, wait a minute, me thinks that crack is slightly larger than the last one, and that if I continue to engage in a similar behavior, the outcome will not be positive. And so one thing that's claimed here is that our intelligence allows us to delay behaving in the service of choosing appropriate alternatives. It also does something even more striking. It allows us, and I would argue that we are unique to all life forms in this regard, to actually imagine things that do not yet exist, and then to have the audacity to transform our dreams into reality. Otto Rank, a psychoanalytical lunatic, said that only humans make the unreal real. Who drew the first pictures of helicopters? Da Vinci. What year? Yeah, one of those years, a long time ago. And when Da Vinci's drawn pictures of helicopters, what are people saying? You're crazy. 500 years later, is that a long time in biologically speaking? Snap of a finger, the crazy man stuff got me here yesterday. So this picture in our minds is converted into reality. I hope you can realize the awesome adaptive potential of being able to dream about that which is not yet here and to make it real. Absolutely. To think that these guys are like flying pieces of wood. Nice. And that's right. And that's nice. Or I wouldn't be here today. I think that that's important for us to think about. Yeah, well, maybe. My bicycle would take me even longer than that, unless I caught a strong tailwind on my way out. All right, so now, let's just think about for a moment the emotional consequences of being so intelligent. And the guy who first started thinking about this, at least in Western thought, was the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard in the 1800s. Anybody hear the name? I don't know. How do you pronounce it? Kierkegaard.
Danish guy. And what Kierkegaard pointed out is that human beings are so intelligent that we become aware of the fact that we exist. In psychology, they call this notion self-consciousness. Right, a potato is, but doesn't know that it is. The cockroach that I smashed in my kitchen is, but doesn't know was, but doesn't know that it is. I am and I know that I am, and I am and I know that I know that I am, and I am and I know that I know that I know that I am, and I am and I know that I know that I know that I know that I am. And you can do that until somebody kills you or you get tired of it and pass out. In other words, not only are you aware of your existence, but you're potentially capable of being aware of that and so on. You ever do that yourself where you're walking down the street, you're like, here I am, walking down the street. All right, now here I am, thinking about the fact that I'm walking down the street, and now here I am thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the fact that I'm walking down the street. And then you just cave and sit on a bench for a while and try and think about what to do next. But the point that these guys want to make is that self-awareness or self-consciousness is the natural result of a fantastically complex mind. An insect can't be self-aware. They lack a complex brain that would allow that kind of cognitive activity to transpire. Because to be self-conscious means that you metaphorically have to be able to step outside of yourself and to imagine yourself, in the words of sociologists, as an object of your own inquiry. But what Kierkegaard said is that the minute you become self-conscious, you necessarily, at least from time to time, experience two very different emotions that Kierkegaard called awe and dread, respectively. And of course, awe is just the root of awesome. You hear that word all the time. That has positive connotations, does it not? What Kierkegaard pointed out is that the reason you'd rather be a person than a potted plant, I hope all of you share my preference in that regard, is that while both of those things, the person and the plant, are alive, only the human being has the sublime privilege of being here and knowing that you're here while you're here. And we should not lose track of the magnificent opportunity to be sentient, but with regard to the very fact of our own existence. Life rules, and that's important for us to remember. On the other hand, as Kierkegaard pointed out, there's something dreadful. Dread sounds like a bad combination of a Grateful Dead and a reggae tune, but right now, what other adjectives does the notion of dread conjure up? Yeah, fear. Fear's too mild. Give me something better. Yeah, horror. How about terror? As I was saying this morning when I gave a talk to class on Mercer Island, when we talk about dread, we mean like fear squared, like a trembling piece of biological protoplasm twitching on the precipice of annihilation. I mean, that's afraid and a little bit more on top of that. Okay, so what is it by virtue of self-consciousness that renders you a twitching pile of biological protoplasm? Well, according to these folks, there's three things that are dreadful that we become aware of simply by virtue of self-consciousness. Thing number one is the central theme of this talk and of your course, and that's, of course, the awareness of our mortality. If you look at the handout that I've given you and just gaze at your leisure, of course, at the Faulkner quote at the top of it, well, what you'll notice that the minute you recognize that you exist, unless you're a child or an idiot, you also must realize that you're not always going to be here. And I hope this isn't news to you, especially in this class. You're all going to die. You know that? Yeah, yes. Okay, how many of you have death on your list of things to accomplish today? Anybody got that on your Rolodex of, go shopping, do the laundry, die as one of your things this week, this year, you're making plans in the immediate future. The point is that death is not something that sits well with any of us. And although we can joke about it or talk about it in an academic venue, with relative equanimity. The claim is that only human beings are explicitly aware of the inevitability of our own demise. And as you'll see, for these folks, it is the awareness of death and our emotional reaction to that awareness that is claimed to fundamentally influence all human activity. What Becker is about to claim is that most of what motivates humans throughout their lives is, psychologically speaking, our inability to come to terms with the awareness that we won't always be here. That's only part of it, however, because on top of the death thing comes what I'll call tragedy for today, for lack of a better word. Not only are you burdened with the ongoing awareness of the inevitability of your death, but you also realize, once again, unless you're a child or an idiot, that you can die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control. And again, not to make light of a terrible situation, but how many of you were reading or looking at the tube about the value jet that went down in the Everglades? Not too big a value for the people that got on that plane. What about the Mount Everest climbers that got blown off the face of the earth? What a downer, right? They're seeing the top of the mountain, 100-mile wind comes up and blows you away. What about when you're in California, when the entire state gets shaken into the ocean by an earthquake? Or you're in McDonald's and a disgruntled postal worker blows your head off before you finish your sandwich. Get that special sauce all over the remains, cranial pate, and anyway, back on track. All right, here's the point, though. You know, that was a good one. That was a good one. All right, you know that if you're lucky, you get to live to a relatively ripe old age, at which point you will turn into a festering pile of rotting compost to feed the next round of insects, and that's if you're lucky. But you know that not all of us are that lucky. In fact, if we meet 10 years from now, statistically speaking, 5 of us won't be here, right? 10% is about the approximate mortality rate. I forget where I got that figure, but it sounds good. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, this guy. Any matters of fact, check with the doctor. I'm the purveyor of hyperbole. But the point is that not all of us are going to keel over from old age. Some of us are going to go down most tragically and unexpectedly. And we're aware of that. It's not only the awareness of death that discombobulates us, it is in addition the awareness that our death can come at any time. And then finally, as Becker points out, and in this regard he's taking his cue from Freud, we also, by virtue of self-consciousness, recognize that we are fundamentally breathing pieces of defecating meat, not fundamentally superior to either lizards or potatoes. You are an ambulatory assortment of entrails that would look the same when your guts got dumped on the sidewalk as the animals that you see crushed on the road after a rainstorm. You're no different than that. You're Spam with a plan, pate with panache. You're a cold cut with an attitude, and you know that at certain points in your life, and that bothers us immensely. I've told this story many times before, but for me, I learned about that most poignantly when I was 12 years old, and my buddy tackled me in a touch football game, and my leg broke. I heard this snap, and I went, oh, that was an interesting sound, like kindling being broken. And then I looked down, and I saw that my right foot was at a 90-degree angle to my leg, and I'm like, I don't remember that. And then I looked at the other side of my ankle, and I saw my bone sticking out. And I'm like, oh, man, this is a problem. And I don't think we're going to be able to get a committee together or like have a bake sale to fix this one. This is when I realized that myself, whatever that means, is ensconced in this physical body that grows old, that is the massive producer of excretory products, and that my very existence is dependent on the ongoing annihilation of other forms of life, as Becker points out most poignantly in the quote that you've got on your handout. Well, all that Becker suggests is that for the average individual, the ongoing awareness that you're going to die, that it could happen at any time, and that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat would literally render us paralyzed with abject terror if we didn't do something about it. In other words, if the only thing you thought about all day is I'm gonna die, a rock could fall on my head and crack my fucking skull, and I'm no different than an armadillo, you wouldn't do much. You just kind of cower in the corner, hoping that you didn't get crushed in the next minute or two. And so for Becker, it is hypothesized that humans resolve the existential dilemma posed by the awareness of their impending mortality, made possible by virtue of the intelligence by which we become aware of ourselves, but by using the very same intelligence that got us into this mess in the first place, in the service of constructing and maintaining what we call culture, or what Becker would call culture. And so what Becker suggests is that culture is a set of humanly created beliefs about the nature of reality that are shared by individuals in a group, and that a primary purpose of culture is to reduce the anxiety associated with the uniquely human awareness of death. I'll say that again just to give me something to do, because I see some of you writing this down. His definition of culture is a humanly constructed set of beliefs about the nature of reality whose primary function, according to this analysis, is to reduce the anxiety associated with the awareness of death. Let me point out, for those of you, any psych major types, well, it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter what your major is, but this is not to suggest that that's the only thing that culture does. What it is to do, rather, is to claim that any adequate understanding of the basic nature of humankind and of the nature of culture must include this notion that it, in part, is serving a defensive psychological function. All right, now, let's think about how culture does that. And so now the issue is, how is it that culture reduces anxiety? And what I want to offer to you in that regard are three things. I want to talk about the notion that culture lends meaning. Secondly, that it confers value. And thirdly, that it serves to deny death. Hence the title of Becker's book, Denial of Death. What Becker suggests, first of all, is that a primary function of culture is to give us a sense that life is meaningful. What he points out is that there's a ton of different cultures in the world around us, and they all seem to be very different. And yet what they share in common, regardless of their superficial differences, is that they all provide answers to universal cosmological questions about the nature of life, and that the answers that are provided are geared ultimately to convince us that we live in a universe that is relatively stable, orderly, and meaningful. All right, now let's just think about that. What do we mean when we talk about cosmological questions? What's cosmological? Anybody? GRE word. Pardon me? Yeah. Cosmological, big questions. And the point is, has a lot of connotations, but the way I want to use it is in the broadest possible sense. How many of you, when you were kids, thought about, do you ever think about where did we come from? You ever have that? No, some of us have. You ever think about what you're supposed to do on Earth, what your special function was? You ever think about what's going to happen to you after you're dead? You ever think about those things? According to Becker, as soon as you're conscious, those questions are going to come up, no matter what time and place you happen to live in. Where do I come from? What do I do? What's going to happen to me? And what he claims is that it is a fundamental aspect of culture to provide us with answers to those questions. And just some obvious examples in that regard. The ones that I talk about most often, and I'll talk about them again today because I haven't thought of new ones, are first of all creation stories, and second of all, is it E? Okay. An E there? D-A-R? Okay, whatever. I just put a lot of vowels there, and whichever one is right was the last one I put there. That's what I used to do in grade school, and never got away with it. But you know what I'm talking about there. Let's talk about creation stories first, just very briefly. You all know that every culture offers an account of how the universe came about. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, how did Earth get here? God, how long did it take man to do it? Now, the big man did it 6 days. 7 was a break, right? And most of us share that belief, whether or not we seriously subscribe to it. But you also know that not all cultures share that particular vision of how the world came about. We have some excellent books in the Skidmore Library about African creation stories, so I'll give you 2 of those that I like a lot. Fulani peoples in Mali believed that the earth was created out of a giant drop of milk, so that when God put the first animals here, they would have something to eat until the 7-Elevens and Domino's Pizza caught up to us. The Yoruba tribe in Nigeria believed that there was just water here at first, and then God came down and put a metal plate on the water. Then he took a snail shell and turned it upside down and put it on the plate, which is now floating on the water. And in the snail shell, he put dirt. And then he put a rooster on the plate next to the upside down snail shell. And as the rooster pecks the dirt out of the shell, that becomes the different continents. Got it? Excellent. Okay, now let's just think for a moment. What do all of those creation stories have in common? God. They have in common one God, and they have in 2 common that they're all ridiculous nonsense that a non-retarded 3rd grader would recognize as such, with regard to them being absolutely veridical accounts of what actually happened. All right, if you want to get feisty with me, I would grant that maybe one of them are right, but does it make sense that they're either all wrong or n-1 of them are, quote, wrong? Right, and my point here, and I'm not trying to be cynical, and neither is Becker, who happened to be a profoundly religious man, and we'll try and come back to religion at the end of all of this. But the point that Becker wants to make is that the function of culture is not to illuminate the truth, but rather instead to obscure the horrifying possibility that we live in a random and indeterminate universe in which the only certainty is the inevitability of our demise. All right, I was going to talk about calendars, but in the interest of time, I'm going to let you think about them in the same way and move on here. Let's just note to begin with that what Becker suggests is that for us to feel relatively at ease, that we must perceive that the world around us is meaningful. How many of you have ever had a day where you've wondered about whether or not life is meaningful? Anybody? Good. That makes you most human. And when you're thinking life has no meaning, is that typically a cause for celebration? What's the affect that you typically associate with the thought that life is meaningless? Yeah. What else? Depression. And Becker, in his 2nd book, which was about depression, said, hey, that's what depression is. When you think life has no meaning, you don't do anything. In Becker's language, action bogs down, and you're turned into a breathing pincushion, incapable of engaging in even the most rudimentary of instrumental behaviors. So what he wants us to think about is that on the one hand, in order to function at all, you have to think that life is meaningful. On the other hand, he says that meaning is necessary but not sufficient unless it is also complemented by the belief that we as individuals are valuable members of that meaningful universe. What he wants to claim is that it's not enough to think that life is meaningful unless you also can perceive yourself as a uniquely valuable contributor to this ongoing cosmic drama. All right, now be honest, how many of you when you were kids ever envisioned yourself doing great stuff? You guy types. I speak more in gender biased terms, because my big thing was I wanted to catch like 100-yard touchdown passes behind my back, the stadium's full of people screaming, and then I wanted to play guitar like Jimi Hendrix at the same time that I was catching 100-yard passes. Some of you might have thought about being Nobel Prize winning scientists or prima ballerinas. Or statesmen, or persons, or lawyers, and so on and so forth. The point that Becker wants to make is this is not pathological narcissism, except perhaps in my case, this is rather a fundamental yearning that represents the basic nature of the human condition. And what Becker suggests is that the way that we feel valuable is in the context of how our culture defines what it means to be a person of value. What he claims is that what culture does is to provide each of us with a set of social roles with associated standards of conduct, the satisfaction of which allows you to perceive yourself as a significant individual.
Coming smoke!
And I'll tell you what I mean by that in simple English momentarily. But the idea here is just that we need to feel not only that life is meaningful, but that we as individuals are persons of value. Right? What Becker does then is to take these two things and to combine them in order to generate his definition of self-esteem. What Becker says, hey, that's what we're talking about when we talk about self-esteem. Self-esteem is the belief that you are a valuable member of a meaningful universe. All right, you see what he's doing? He's taking these two ideas and combining them in a way that says that when you have value plus meaning, that you feel good about yourself. That's self-esteem. And that self-esteem is the psychological construct through which culture exerts its anxiety buffering influences. All right, now, that may not have made any sense, kind of obscure, but let's pass that on and talk about a few other ideas on our way to doing these other things. Thing number one is to note that according to this analysis, every one of us needs self-esteem. In all times and places, self-esteem is of central importance. In fact, Becker declares that it is the dominant human motive, and that ultimately, though, it's serving a defensive function, which is to reduce anxiety. But one of the interesting and I think frighteningly provocative implications of this analysis is that while we all need self-esteem, the way that we get it is always relative to the time and place that you happen to be existing in. Because that which would convey immense regard in one social milieu might have quite the opposite effect in another. And the best example I can offer you of that is just the distinction between individualistic versus more communal cultures. You know how in the West we value the rugged individual who's fiercely independent and strikes out on their own? Well, in the East, as you know, in Asian culture, where they value community and cooperation, they have a saying that the nail that sticks out will get hammered back in. The idea being that that which makes you Donald Trump and a hero in one culture would render you a colossal asshole in another. And we can laugh about that, but what's interesting here is that the road to self-esteem is never anything that can be pursued autonomously, because what it means to be a person of value is almost always ultimately culturally prescribed. There's very few things besides incest that are universally valued or loathed. And anything that you can tell me that we hate in our society, I can give you another example of a society that loves it. I just think there's something interesting about that that ought concern us. But we don't have time to linger on that too much, so let's get to our central concern for today, which is this notion of culture being a means to deny death. I should point out, by the way, just in passage, that on this piece of paper that you should definitely stare at some point, that's what Berger and Luckman are doing in this social construction or reality thing. But I think more revealingly is what Alfonso Ortiz, the Tiwa Indian down there from New Mexico, is saying. This is in the October 1994 issue of National Geographic. The Tiwas are in the Southwest in New Mexico. And so let's read what Alfonso says. A Tiwa is interested in our own story of our origin, for it holds all that we need to know about our people and how one should live as a human. The story defines our society. It tells me who I am, where I came from, the boundaries of my world, what kind of order exists within it, how suffering, evil, and death came into this world, and what is likely to happen to me when I die. And so note that here's Ortiz, never having had a class in his life, right? The ultimate wisdom does not require the academy, as you're painfully aware, although we try and hide that from our students as professor types. But here's Alfonso saying the same thing. This is what culture does for us. It is the psychological ballast upon which our equilibrium rightfully depends. But it only works if, besides meaning and value, culture can purchase what we're really after, and that's immortality, either symbolically, don't knock anything over, or either symbolically or literally. So let's talk about the denial of death. Let me find a place on the board here. And let's think about this in two ways. At the level of symbol, so let's think about it symbolically, and then literally. And what Becker points out is that with a few important exceptions that are necessary for us to understand that all cultures that we're aware of offer their constituents some hope of immortality, either symbolically or literally. At the symbolic level, Plato talked about this whenever he was breathing a long time ago in Greece. And what Plato said is, hey, one of the reasons why people like to do big stuff, like build big buildings, write symphonies, have shit tons of money, is that while you know that you will not be here forever, there is some comfort in the knowledge that a physical manifestation of you remains nevertheless, right? That's why whenever some rich guy buys a building, what's the first thing he usually does? Yeah, you name it after yourself. If I see one more Trump building, you don't have Donald Trump. You know who I'm talking about? In New York, every block is like Trump Tower, Trump's Pizza Parlor, Trump. And there's more Trumps than Rockefeller stuff now. But the point is, for Plato, that's even one of the reasons why we have kids. The notion that any kid, people here, who's got kids? I never thought that was true until I saw my own mini replicas. I'm like, oh, here's my kids. There's me. The bottom of the gene pool has been reached once again. But Plato said, hey, at the symbolic level, you realize that you're not going to be here, but there's going to be some vestige of your existence that remains nevertheless. Right, but, as you know, we also take this quite literally through what dominant social institution? Where do you get literal immortality? Yeah, from religion, typically. As you know, we'll just do this very quickly. Most religious traditions offer hope of literal immortality. In the Christian tradition, life may suck on earth, but if you do the right thing, you qualify for immortality, whether you be a dipstick for a cesspool or the president of IBM. Doesn't matter. Everybody can win. Same thing in Eastern thought. You go through a successive series of reincarnations until you get it right, and then what do you reach? Nirvana, at which point you don't have to keep coming back as a carcass. You can hang out in this ephemeral mist that I look forward to becoming forever. Rules. Immortality rules. It's big. All right, then. That's what these guys are suggesting. All right, so now the issue is okay, well, so what? If you grant that these ideas are important, or if you even grant momentarily that there's some validity to them, what implications does all of this have for helping us to understand about ourselves and the world around us? And What Becker says is, look, I think what we should do, or at least one of the things that he suggests, is that we look at different cultures and our own in order to develop better ones. What he says is, look, all cultures pretty much do the same thing. They are vehicles to help us understand the nature of the world around us and to provide us with opportunities to feel good about ourselves in the service of perceiving that we might someday be immortal. But having said that, Becker vehemently opposes the notion of cultural relativity. Have they talked about that, or the use of that term? Yeah. Okay, have you heard the term cultural relativity before? That's just this idea that every culture's different and there's no grounds to make judgments between them because they're all just different. Becker rejects that unequivocally. He just says, look, that me speaking for him, he says, I think that that's bullshit. I think you can and must make judgments about the relative utility of different kinds of cultures with regard to the extent that they help us live and to the extent that they help us die. And what he goes on to do is to say, well, okay, what do we mean when we talk about a culture being potentially better than another? And Becker says, well, he's dying by this point, actually. It's 1974. He's running out of time. He's in the hospital with cancer, writing his last book. It's like, okay, let me give you some idea of what the difference is between what he would claim is a good culture and what he would claim is a less than good culture. And he says 4 things that I'll talk about today. So good culture. The first thing that he says is that a good culture provides for the physical needs of its citizens, given its current level of technology and its present access to natural resources. So let's just say that good culture provides for physical needs of its people within limits of technology and resources. How much time do we have, Jim, until the class ends? Oh, nice. I'm going to shut up within 15 minutes so we have some time to talk, and so I just wanted to see where I'm at here. The idea here is that you can't be worried about self-esteem or physical or psychological transcendence unless you're still breathing, right? And in order to do that, you've got to have enough to eat, you've got to have a place to live, you have to be educated in whatever sense of the word your culture employs that term. And so the primary responsibility of all cultures is to deliver the physical goods necessary in order to survive. Psychology types, who else talks about that? You got to provide for physical needs first before psychological needs. Maslow, good. This is pure Maslow, and that's where Becker's getting it. I don't want to spend too much time on this except to point out to you that by this standard, how do we do as Americans? Huh? Terrible. How many Americans are starving? Pardon me? 10% of the American population is starving by anybody's definition. Any homeless people in America? Unemployed? Uninsured and uncared for medically? All right, are any of these things because we lack the physical resources to do them? Remember, we're a country that pays farmers to not grow food because we have so much of it. So just note that we have plenty of technology, we have plenty of resources. By this standard, we are one of the most derelict cultures on the face of the earth, in the sense that no other culture has the potential to provide for its citizens to the extent that we do, and no other culture, one might argue, falls as short as we do in that regard. I don't mean that critically, but I mean it truly because it's the case. All right, now, let's think about that and just pursue this a little bit more. Why is it that, why don't we feed everybody? When you ask Newt Gingrich, pardon me? Well, what do we lack, according to those guys? What do we have? We'd like to feed everybody, but we don't have enough what? What don't we have enough of? Anybody? What does everybody say? What's our big issue? Money. Okay, now note, and this is important. We got to take a 5-minute diversion to talk a little bit about money. All right, what is money? Good. Money is useless abstraction that has no value whatsoever except to the extent that we agree that it has some. This piece of paper, it's a big one, any rules. In the Himalayas, unless I need toilet paper, this is worthless, right? This money, by its definition, all money is useless. Its value depends on our mutual consent. And in fact, this money used to be backed by what in the old days? Gold. What's it now backed by? Not zilch. What's it say on the back of every bill? Who are we trusting? Not gold. Trusting God. So note one of Becker's big points, which is money is the ultimate secular religious icon, functionally indistinguishable from all other religious, economic, or political ideologies, and should be seen for what it is in that regard. And all he asks us to think about is the awkward reality that, in fact, we have plenty of technology, we have plenty of resources, we have plenty of people to do anything that we want. What we seem to lack is an adequate quantity of what he would consider to be a death-denying religious illusion, much in the same way that he talks about other such institutions. I'll just toss that out as something for you to think about. Let me hide my money, though, so that none of you take it. All right, having said that, let's move on to point number 2, and that's that it is also imperative that a good culture provide for as many people as possible opportunities to feel good about themselves. So here we get to the self-esteem thing. Good culture provides self-esteem. I'm going to abbreviate here and go for this. Self-esteem for as many people as possible. Obviously, this should follow from what I've said. If we take this idea seriously, then we can also ask, relative to different cultures, how many opportunities are there in the culture for you to feel good about yourself? Right now, if you're a Christian and you believe in Christianity, is everybody eligible for salvation? Right, and in that regard, is not Christianity the ultimate egalitarian religion in that everybody is at least abstractly eligible for the main man to take you into his house forever, right? Right now, most of us know that the Judeo-Christian tradition in America has waned somewhat of late, to be somewhat understated. And what is it now that we measure ourselves according to in American culture? Money. Right? But how many of us can be fantastically wealthy in American culture? Good. And therefore the 99% that are not are what in the eyes of America? We're worthless failures right underneath whale shit at the bottom of the ocean. So note that there's something else interesting about American culture, and that is that we are in the interesting position of valuing that which most of us could not reasonably expect to have. Because if you don't have money, what should you have in America at least? What's that? All right, smart. I think even being smart has become passé. Jimmy Carter was smart. Pardon me? Looks. The two things are looks and money, especially if you're a woman. An ugly guy with cash can get away with it, but if you're a woman and you look like you were walking to the bank and got hit in the face with a bag of nickels, you're in trouble. Or you've been playing goalie for the dart team, you have a fire in your face and they had to put it out with a javelin, you're in trouble. I have a few more of those. That used to pass for humor in my college days. I still like it though. Silliness is good. All right, now, But the point is to not be silly for a moment. Here's another instance where Becker would say, geez, we've got to take a look at what we're doing in our culture. And I would suggest to you that this is a real problem, that Americans are suffering from massive deficits in feelings of self-worth. 1/3 of the American population will have sought treatment for depression, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, by the turn of the century. There were 80 million Valium prescriptions doled out in this country in 1983, making Valium the 3rd most consumed pharmaceutical on earth, right behind aspirin and vitamins. We got 50 million, conservatively speaking, alcoholics, and so on and so forth. That doesn't even count like Republicans and other forms of pathology that I would argue can only be understood in terms of the absence of self-worth. I didn't mean to get political. I couldn't help it. Couldn't help there. But anyway, and of course that, if you feel free to disagree with me in that regard. The point is, and adolescent suicide is on the rise. And it's not the crack babies in Harlem that live in refrigerator boxes that are killing themselves. It's the white kids in the upper class suburbs that are finding it very difficult to feel good about themselves in a climate of rising expectations accompanied by diminishing opportunities. And this is something we need to think about. Right. The third thing here is the idea that you accomplish these first 2 goals without unduly inconveniencing other individuals, either outside or inside of the culture that you reside in. All right, so let's say do 1 and 2 without hurting others. So what I'm saying here, I'm getting lazy in writing in shorthand, but what I'm saying is that for Becker, the third criterion is, well, look, how well do you satisfy your physical needs and your need for self-esteem without damaging other individuals, either in or outside the culture. All right, now check it out. You need